So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this event. Just a couple of housekeeping matters that we need to cover. One is that the event is being recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, you can turn off your camera. But all our events normally are recorded, both because we can look at them afterwards and also for security purposes. I'd like now to hand over to Shulamit to open the proceedings.
Hello. I think as everyone here knows, I'm Rabbi Shulamit Amberley, one of the rabbis at Sha'arei, and we're so honoured that you're here joining us live from Canada, Ruthie, to tell your mother's story, because we truly believe there's so much to learn from her life and also about how she tells her story. It's the story not only of her survival, but of course of the many, many, many who helped her to survive. Your mother is now quite elderly, and but only 2 years ago, she was able to lead her 18th March of the Living, but she's not as strong as she was. So very sadly, she can't be with us today. But we're absolutely delighted that we're able to use the technology, and you can join us from Canada. So this evening, we will be showing video testimony from your mother, Anita, with the discussions with you. And there'll be a chance for questions at the end. To begin the evening, though, I'd love to hand over to Lorraine Feldman, who's going to share with us all your connection with Sha'arei.
Thank you, Shulamit. Thank you, Shulamit, for giving me the opportunity to introduce my friend and our guest speaker for tonight's event, Ruthie Ekstein. Ruthie and I have known each other for over 30 years. When we met when Ruthie and her husband, Alan, were travelling from Toronto on their way to Israel as part of their honeymoon trip and decided to stop over to visit Alan's family in London first. They called us and we met for dinner one evening. We hit it off, and since that day, our friendship has grown stronger and our lives and families have intertwined. Our friendship is a result of another special bond that was established almost 6 years ago when Edgar and Dot, my husband Ashley's parents, met Alan's parents, Brian and Belle Letcham, through the synagogue. Alan and Ashley went to Cubs, Scout and Religion School together at Queen's Avenue, and both sets of parents were active members in the community. When Belle and Brian immigrated to Canada in the 1970s, Edgar, Dot, Belle and Brian kept in touch. Over the past 30 years, Ashley and I have shared many special times with Alan and Ruthie, celebrating the bar and bat mitzvahs of our children, birthdays and holidays together, both here in Europe and in Toronto. In 2019, we visited Toronto to celebrate the wedding of their eldest daughter, Lara, to Ryan, and then joined the online celebration of their son, Kobe's wedding to Hannah last October. All our children have an incredible bond, and we are honoured to be part of Alan's extended family in the UK and to have built an equally strong relationship with Ruthie's family in Canada and the States. I'm delighted that Ruthie is here with us this afternoon to share her mum's incredible story.
So before we go over to you, Ruthie, I'd love to say that I've really had such an incredible opportunity to immerse myself in your mother's story of her survival through her book, Always Remember Who You Are. And you can see the front page of the book behind me, as well as the wonderful video archives that are stored in organisations such as the Azrieli Foundation online. I feel so lucky to be touched by her extraordinary personality and overawed actually by the sheer number of people whose single acts contributed to her survival, so that she not only was able to survive, but to go on and tell her story. and to teach and to become a leading Holocaust educator in Canada and worldwide. So much so that the Frank and Anita Ekstein collection, now part of the Neuberger Holocaust Education Centre in Toronto, now houses over 9,000 pieces of separate testimony. And she has also been past chair and then a survivor speaker for decades at that same Holocaust Education Centre in Toronto. Your mother there's so much we could say. She was at the first International Conference of Hidden Children in 1991, and then went on to start a group for hidden children in Toronto later the same year. She went on to organise the first International Hidden Children and Second Generation Conference in 2001, and has been chair of March of the Living Canada, and as I mentioned before, has marched as a survivor chaperone 18 times, that is 18 years, together with, of course, you, your siblings, and most of her grandchildren. She holds numerous awards, far too many to list here, but including a Canadian Award for Services to the Elderly, the Canadian Shem Tov Award in 1998 for Services to Holocaust Education, and in 2002, the Elie Wiesel Holocaust Remembrance Medal. Indeed, I believe she's winning an extraordinary award for a lifetime of education, commitment to education, Holocaust education today in Canada. Together with you and your late father, Frank, she was able to travel to Poland, to her childhood home, and also to the Ukraine and to the village where your grandfather was murdered, as well as the places where she herself was hidden. She successfully nominated her rescuers to Yad Vashem as Righteous Among the Nations, and was there to see their daughter, Luisa, receive the medal herself from the Israeli ambassador to Poland. I've only touched very briefly on many of your wonderful mother's achievements. And of course, I know you've been with her for so many of the steps in the way in her mission to tell her story. We think it's incredibly important to everyone here to hear you tell that story now. So I'm going to begin with asking you to outline for us her life from the age of 5 when the invasion of Poland first took place, or indeed, if you prefer, from the age of 7 when she and her family lost their home, until the time that she arrives in Canada. So big, huge welcome, and over to you.
First of all, thank you so very much to Lorraine for inviting me, and the rabbi for inviting me. And thank you so very much for allowing me to share my mom's story with you today. My mom would have been sharing her story on Yom HaShoah for the last 35, 40 years. And unfortunately, she's just not able to do that anymore. So I'm really honored that I have this opportunity to continue in her footsteps today. So just for a little bit of context, my mom, Anita, she was born July 18, 1934. And she was born in Synovichko Vodzia, which was the eastern part of Poland near Lvov. It's today the Ukraine, and it was a very populous part of the Jewish Polish world. Her dad, Fischl, was one of 5, came from a traditional family. His father was a leading educator and teacher, and my grandfather became an accountant at a lumber mill. My grandmother was one of 10, and she came from an ultra-Orthodox family. Her father was, in fact, a rabbi. She was also very much ahead of her time. She was very well educated. She spoke many languages. She went to work, which was very unusual in the 1930s. One other tiny unusual thing about her is that she was 7 years older than my grandfather. And that was a secret that no one knew until actually the day of my wedding. The reason I'm just giving you that very brief outline of the beginnings was I want you to understand that my mom was part of a very large, loving Jewish family. And 6 years after the war began, she was one of a handful of this massive family that was still left alive. September 1939, World War II broke out. Mom remembers the Polish soldiers running east with shoes in their hands and gas masks being distributed. What the Poles didn't know is that just prior to the war, the Germans and the Russians agreed to a non-aggression pact. The Germans took the west hand side of Poland, and immediately that came under Nazi control. The Russians took the eastern part of Poland, and that came under Russian control. My mom and her parents were in that Russian side of Poland. And Mom would tell you that there really wasn't a lot that changed in the first 2 years of the war for her. She remembered there being less food, and she knows that her parents continued to work. They just worked for Russian owners as opposed to Polish owners. But for the most part, their life was unchanged. They were allowed to socialize and visit the family who lived under Russian occupation. But very importantly, they had absolutely no idea what was happening under the German occupied regions of Poland. They had no idea of the fate of the Jews or their family members who lived in that part of Poland. June 1941, with Operation Barbarossa, everything changed overnight. The Germans had, by this point, more or less conquered Western Europe. They got cocky, and they decided to invade Russian-occupied Poland, where Mom was, and in fact, all of Russia. As the Russians started to retreat in June, the locals didn't know what was happening, but what did happen was that the Ukrainians unleashed a deadly pogrom against the Jews of that neighborhood. And had my mom and her parents not been saved by their landlord, they would have been killed in that very deadly time period. They were hidden in the landlord's barn in the attic for over a week. He brought them food, he gave them news of the outside world, and then the chaos stopped because the Germans arrived. And the moment the Germans arrived, the annihilation of the Jews of that part of the world began. Immediately, things changed. All the restrictions that you know of that were imposed wherever the Germans went were imposed pretty much overnight. My grandparents lost their jobs. Their bank accounts were frozen. There were tremendous restrictions on where they could go, what they could do. Everything of value was taken away from them, including radios, jewelry, fur coat collars off of coats. There was very little food. There was a tremendous amount of fear. And then Jewish people started to disappear. On October the 1st, 1941, my family was disappeared. They were taken in the middle of the night and moved to Skole, which was a town not that far away, where they were collecting all of the Jews of the area and putting them into the Skole Ghetto. This was one of the first ghettos in the region. And you need to remember the purpose of the ghetto was to murder Jews. It was to murder them via starvation, disease, and slave labor. My parents, my mom and her parents were forced into an apartment with a few other families under terrible conditions. Her parents were taken for slave labor. And my mom does not remember a lot of this period. She was 7 years old. She was left alone in the ghetto. And what she does remember is being cold, being hungry, and being petrified that her parents would not come back to her at the end of each day. Somehow, life went on for a full year in the ghetto until the very fateful day of October 18, 1942. By this point, the final solution was being implemented. And the final solution was the statement that killing Jews by ghetto was too slow and too inefficient, and killing Jews via Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units, was too slow, and it was psychologically hard on the shooters. So they came up with the concept of the death camps, which were exclusively for the mass industrial scale murder of the Jews. In the part of Europe, part of Poland, now the Ukraine, where my mom found herself, there was something called Operation Reinhardt, which was their part of the final solution. That was the building of Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. And what the Germans were doing, as you all know, was they were rounding up the Jews and sending them to these death camps. On that fateful day of October the 18th, 1942, there was an action in the ghetto. My grandmother was unfortunately grabbed by the Nazis, who were looking for any Jew they could get their hands on that day. 1 minute she was there, and the next minute she was gone. She was pushed into a cattle car, transported to Belzec. They didn't know it at the time, but we now do know she went to Belzec the same day that she was taken. And along with 450,000 other Jews who were gassed to death at Belzec, she lost her life within an hour of arrival at that death camp. My mom was now alone in the ghetto, a little girl, 8 years old, and my grandfather was absolutely desperate. He wanted to save her, and he didn't know how. He was still being used as slave labor and working in a hut as an accountant, using his accountancy skills. And in that place, non-Jews were able to come and work for pay. He met and befriended a Polish Catholic man by the name of Mr. Matuszewicz. Mr. Matuszewicz was a Polish officer. He was also very well educated, and he was an extremely devout Catholic. My grandfather befriended him and begged him to save my mother. And inexplicably, this incredible man said yes. He would do whatever he could to save this little Jewish child that he had never laid eyes on. My grandfather had to explain to my mom that she had to go with this stranger. And of course, she did not want to go with him. She had just lost her mother. She did not want to leave her father. But Mr. Matuszewicz was able to take her out of the ghetto. He spirited her away in the night, and he took her to his town of Rodzol, which was about 10 kilometers away. He left her with his wife and his adopted daughter, Lucia, and instructed them to teach my mother how to be a Catholic Polish little girl as quickly as possible. Because you see, to help a Jew in any way, shape, or form at this time was a crime. And the crime was punishable by death. So the Matuszewicz family took their lives, they put their lives at risk to save a little 8-year-old Jewish child. So my mom arrived with them before Christmas 1942, and she learned how to be a good little Catholic girl. They were very devout, they prayed twice a day, they were in church all the time, and things could have gone on indefinitely like that had my mother and the family not been denounced by a Ukrainian neighbor who literally pointed out, likely for about a pound of sugar, that they believed there was a little Jewish girl being hidden in that home. As the soldiers approached the front door, it was just by pure luck that Lucia, the daughter, saw them coming, and she picked up my mother and she ran with her and literally threw her out the back window of the house into the snow. When you see the cover of the book, it shows a window and footprints in the snow, and that was depicting my mom being saved by this woman by having been thrown into the snow, told to run and hide and not come back. My mom hid in the outhouse and heard shots all night. What they found out the next morning was that there had been an attempt to find all of the Jews who'd been hidden in Rodzol at that time that day, and all of the Jews that they found were shot and killed. My mom was one of the only ones that was not caught, but it became eminently clear that she could not stay with the Matuszewicz family any longer. Mr. Matuszewicz came and took her away. and where to take her. He had nowhere to go except to take her back to her father, who was in the Skole Ghetto. But at this time, the Skole Ghetto had been completely liquidated, and of the thousands of people who had been there were only 30 people left. My grandfather was one of them. My mom stayed with him for 7 weeks. She stayed in the room where he was held prisoner, and when he went out to work during the day, he put her and hid her in the wardrobe, a piece of furniture. He told her, Anita, stay there, don't say a word, don't come out, just stay put. I don't know how an 8-year-old child does that for 7 weeks, but she did. And in the meantime, Mr. Matuszewicz had been searching for a solution to save my mother one more time. And he did. He went to a parish priest, got false papers, and instantly my mother became Anna Jaworska. And with those false papers, she was able to travel. He came, and once again, she had to say goodbye to her father. I don't know what my grandfather must have said to her in order to make my mother leave him a second time, but I'm sure he promised her everything and anything. He would join her, he would come. But he saved her life by making her go again with Mr. Matuszewicz. He took my mother by train far east to his nephew, who was a parish priest in a very, very primitive town right on the Russian border. He lived there with his housekeeper, and they kept my mother for an entire year, continuing to educate her in the art and science of Catholicism. My mother was really not allowed out of the house very much for year of her being found out. And she spent most of that year running after a cow who it was her responsibility to make sure the cow didn't get lost. And I can tell you to this day, my mother still hates that cow. She stayed with this family until April 1944, at which point the Russians were moving west and liberating parts of the country as they moved westward. Liberation in 1944 was not a fun thing. The Russians themselves were starved, draggled, and as they moved westward, they were stealing everything they could get their hands on, and they were raping the women as they went. It was quite a scary time for my mom, but she did manage to avoid any of those circumstances. And in the next month, the Matuszewicz themselves had been liberated, and they sent for my mom. So in May, June 1944, she was reunited back with Mrs. Matuszewicz and her daughter Lucia, and found that Mr. Matuszewicz had been sent to Siberia because he had worked for the Germans. And so he was sent far away, and as of 1944, they had no idea the fate of Mr. Matuszewicz or the fate of my grandfather. My mother still didn't know what had happened to him. A year passes, and now the war is over. And again, there is no joyousness in liberation. In fact, there was chaos and violence again. The nationalist Ukrainians of where my mom was living with the Matuszewicz family wanted the Poles out. So they were forced to evacuate over a crazy 6-week period, much further west in Poland, where they finally settled in Kluczbork. And in Kluczbork, my Mrs. Matuszewicz said to my mom, "You're going to stay with me. You're going to continue to be my family, and therefore you must be baptized." So my mom was baptized. She stayed with the family. In January 1946, Mr. Matuszewicz somehow found them, reunited with them in Kluczbork. And my mother expected that she would stay as a family member and be raised as a Polish Catholic child. And if not for one miraculous act, she would have stayed and remained in Poland as a Polish Catholic child. And the miraculous act was that a month before my grandfather was murdered it was in July 1943. He had the foresight to give Mr. Matuszewicz a letter. In that letter, he explained to his family what had happened and that he had given Anita to Mr. Matuszewicz. And he also included the addresses of family members both in Poland and around the world in the hopes that someone would be able to take my mom at the end of the war. Unbeknownst to my mom, when Mr. Matuszewicz returned in February 1946, he wrote to all of those family members. All the ones in Poland were dead. But there were two family members. My mother's mother had a brother and a sister, so two siblings who went to New York in the 1920s. And the letter reached them. And by another set of miracles, they had just received a letter from their youngest sibling, my grandmother's baby sister, Auntie Sally. Auntie Sally was saved by Schindler, and she was a mere 100 kilometers away in Poland. And the letters crossed, the information got to Auntie, and the family in New York said, we will do everything in the world to get you and Anita out of Poland. Just go get Anita. And on April 1st, April Fool's, 1946, my Auntie Sally showed up in Klugeborg, knocked on the door and said, hello, Anita, I'm your Auntie Sally, and I am here to take you home. She, in the end, does get my mother out of Europe back to Canada where they continued on with their lives. I think I will stop my narrative right at this particular moment. Because I understand I'll have an opportunity to tell you the rest of that story later. And I'll hand it back over to the rabbi at this point.
Thank you so much. You've said, and I think your mother said that her experiences were always part of family life. But there was a key trigger to her beginning to tell her story and speak about it as an educator. And I'd love to introduce now a piece of film that we have from the archive of the Azrieli Foundation, where she begins to speak about the trigger of beginning to talk. So we're going to go over to that first film now.
I have to give back to this country. You know, it welcomed us. I've had a good life here. My children were born here, they're all Canadians. And I just feel I need to give back a little bit. And then when I got involved with the Holocaust Center and they wanted me to speak, I didn't want to, but at that time, Ernest Zundel, does the name mean anything to you? There was a big dude that he was arrested and there was all kinds of, he was a Holocaust denier. And I think that got me going for crazy. I went to the trial and it was terrible. And when I heard him telling, it didn't happen, it's a lie. I think then I told the Holocaust Center, I want to talk. And that's how it started. You know what? It takes everything out of me every time. But I feel it's important. I don't do it as often as I used to. I just can't. It's just too difficult.
So she said it takes everything out of me, but of course, she did this work for so many years. But I know at the beginning, Ruthie, your father was quite opposed, wasn't he? Your late father, Frank, felt it would really be harmful for her to begin to tell this story. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about that, about the impact for your mother on beginning to tell the story of this as a personal experience for her.
You know, growing up at home, we lived with the Holocaust at the kitchen table. It was absolutely everywhere in our lives. We all knew my mom's story from a very young age, and everything seemed to be a reminder. If you didn't eat your dinner, we were reminded that she had starved. And every holiday, every family event, there were so many tears because she wanted her parents. She missed her parents so desperately. And Auntie Sally, the lady who took her out of Europe, Auntie Sally had really been the strongest person I know right up until she got to Canada. And once she established herself here, she fell apart. And she just couldn't cope with the fact that she had lost her children, her husband, her family, everyone. And so we were her caregivers. So she was with us all the time. And that reminder of the Holocaust was absolutely everywhere, permeating our home. And yet, my mother never spoke about it outside the home. Her very best friends had no idea of her story. They simply knew she came from Europe. And then in the 1980s, I think three things came together all at the same time that really impacted Mum and many of the other survivors in Toronto. Firstly, the survivors were starting to die. My aunt had remarried a gentleman called Jack Goldstein. Uncle Jack survived Auschwitz by working at Canada, which is where they sorted the belongings that they took from the dead bodies of the Jews. He was an extremely damaged man, and he died in the 80s. And as he died, my mother realized that no one was telling his story. No one was telling the stories of the survivors that we were beginning to lose. And she felt a tremendous obligation to honor their memory. That was one. The second major thing was Ernst Zundel. So Ernst Zundel was a Holocaust denier, and he had really established himself as one of the leading deniers in the United States. And the United States kicked him out. So he came to Toronto and he carried on that work. And when the survivors heard him saying that it had never happened and it was a lie, exactly as my mother described, they all started to find their voices. And in fact, they established the Holocaust Education Center. It's the only one that I know of that was survivor initiated. And the third thing I think that really happened all at the same time was my mom went back to university. She got her degree in psychology, and she'd never been able to finish school because she'd had to go back to work. And here she was, graduating from university and truly finding her voice. All of these three things happened at the same time, and that was what gave her the strength and the courage to get out there and to start speaking. She spoke, as the rabbi indicated, she's spoken to thousands, if not tens of thousands of people in the last 35, 40 years. I'd just like to end this by saying that speaking gave my mother real purpose and meaning to her life. And when my dad died in 2003, it actually became her entire reason for living. And so as difficult as it was for her to be speaking, and my dad did not want her to be speaking, which was sort of the beginning of this question. My dad didn't want it because he was so afraid that it would be too traumatic for my mom. And very honestly, he was afraid that it would be too traumatic for the rest of the family because we were so completely immersed in the sadness and the heaviness of the Holocaust all the time. But my mom was determined to speak. She found her voice, and once she got going, he was actually very, very supportive over time. There were moments when it was difficult, but he did become one of her bigger supporters over time.
And you can entirely understand that, I think. I mean, I completely, I find it really just so understandable that this conflict would happen, and that would be a journey for both of them. As you say, seeing what happened to Auntie Sally, and what, you know, the damage for her and the entire family who have to get to grips with this, with their experiences. I would love to go back to, as you say, this wonderful childhood. So she had a very happy, secure childhood, a very loving home, small family, because she was, as she'll tell us, the only child, but a very wide circle of extended family. And her memories of this time are captured in the piece of film we're going to see now.
I was born in Lvov, but we lived in a town called Synovodsko-Vizhny. You can't pronounce it, because my father worked there. He was an accountant, and he worked for a chain of lumber mills. And that's why we lived there. It was a smaller town, not far from Stray. There were several Jewish families there. Life was good. I was an only child. I was born by cesarean section, and my mother was not allowed to have any more children. So that's why I was an only child. So of course they spoiled me. And my father was a very tall man, used to take me for walks on his shoulder. And my mother was short like me. But I had a wonderful childhood till the age of 7. Yeah, we traveled to my, to my grandparents and aunts and uncles, and we spent holidays with them. It was good. It was nice.
I love that challenge. I feel I want to have a go at pronouncing Synovodsko-Vizhny. I really tried to have a go at that. But then, as you said, and as she'll tell us, the Russians had invaded Poland when your mother was 5. And then after the German invasion in 1941, the family were forced into the Skole Ghetto. And she's going to talk about her experiences in our next extract, which we're going to show now.
When we got to the ghetto, I didn't know where we were. I didn't know what's happening. I didn't know why we were there. But we were not the only ones. There were, all the Jews from my town, plus the Jews in the Skole in the larger town were put in the ghetto. And there was no barbed wire, but they were watching. The soldiers were all over the place. And we were put in an apartment with 2 other families, so we each had a room. Coming from a home where I had my own bedroom and everything, all toys, I was petrified. I didn't know what's going on. And my parents, especially my father, kept reassuring me, everything's going to be okay, we're together, everything is fine. So that went on for about a year. But my parents were taken daily to different job sites, and I was left with a neighbor, and I worried all day, are they going to come back? Am I going to see them again? Because people kept disappearing from the ghetto. And I was old enough to hear, people talk. So when I saw them come home, it was, thank God.
There are some very painful stories. And of course, at an event, your mother is always choosing which stories to tell at which point in time. And that raises some real questions for me about why and how we tell stories, about which we choose to tell, and the purpose of them. And of course, we tell them because of this imperative to tell the truth. And that truth does include moments of extraordinary escape, as well as love and loss. And in our discussions preparing for today, Ruthie, I asked you, which story would your mum, do you think, choose to tell at this point? Because they are so painful, some of these stories. And you said that your mother would certainly want to tell the story of the moment that she lost her mother, your grandmother, forever. So I wanted to just ask you about that for a moment, because I think you said that this was a real story that sort of is seared on her, in her memory and her consciousness, really, for the whole of her life. Would you just say perhaps a little bit about that for us now, before we watch that short film?
It was one of the single most important, powerful, emotional, scary, horrific moments of her life. And it is absolutely seared in her brain. The year prior, there's not a lot of clear memory. But that day, she remembers in Technicolor. She remembers the detail, and she remembers the horror. It's absolutely impacted her for the rest of her life. And I can tell you now, as her memory is unfortunately deteriorating, and she spends a lot of time going back in her mind to times from the war and early childhood. This is a particular memory that she will take with her to her grave, and it still is a source of great, great distress.
It must be so painfully hard for you in your family to be with her as she suffers from this so much at this point in her life. Let's now watch this short extract in which she calls somebody watching over me.
October 18th, 1942. I was on the street with my mother in the ghetto. I don't know if she said she was going to try and find some food. Where, I have no idea. And all of a sudden, she decided to leave me with a friend. To this day, I don't know why. Why? Did she see something? Did she hear something? I don't know. She said to me, I'm going out for a while. I'll be back for you. When she went out, a truck came by and they picked her up. I didn't see it, but the neighbor did. They put her on the truck and she was gone. Just like that. Minutes before, I was with her on the street. I guess somebody was watching over me. I don't know. I don't know why. She saved my life that day. She did. I don't know if she knew she was going to save my life, but she did. Why did she leave me at that particular moment with a friend? And of course, my father was desperate when he found out that she was gone. So then he put all his efforts into trying to save me.
As you said before, your mum was rescued from the ghetto by Josef Matusevich, and she says in the book that his position granted him special access into the ghetto. One night he snuck inside to collect me. I had to say goodbye to my father. I didn't want to go. I clung to him, and when we could no longer delay the inevitable, Josef put me in a large bag and carried me out of the ghetto like I was a sack of potatoes. I was cautioned not to make any noise, not to move, not to draw any attention to myself. Years later, she learned that there was a police station located directly behind the space that they left from. She says, I don't know how he managed to take me out or bring anything in. It really was a miracle that we weren't caught. She then, as you said before, lives with the Matusevich family and is given an urgent induction into Catholicism. And her book really communicates very powerfully how this faith became part of her life. And of course, not only with the Matusevich family, but also with their nephew, Father Michael, who, as you said, protected her for another year. And she became very attached as a young child to that faith. And later on, when she writes her book, she describes in a very clear, sighted way her return to Judaism. Can you share a bit about her experience and her relationship to Catholicism?
Becoming a Catholic for Mum was not a choice. It was imperative. She had to be Catholic to save her life. She had to be Catholic to save the lives of the Matuszewicz family. And she understood that even though she was so little, she clearly understood that. And then she was immersed in Catholicism. The Matuszewicz family and Father Michael, and participating in church, in prayer, absolutely day in, day out, round the clock. And she told me recently that when she was with Father Michael, the only books that she even had available to her were Bible stories. So every aspect of her life, she was engaging in Catholicism. She started to believe that if she would be a good Catholic, then maybe Jesus would protect her father and bring her father back to her. And the more that idea got into her head, the more willing she was to be Catholic. And you also need to remember she was afraid to be Jewish. She was absolutely petrified to be Jewish because by being Jewish, she would be dead. So it was a push-pull. She was being pushed away from being Jewish at the same time that she was really being pulled to be Catholic. And until my aunt came into her life, she really thought that she would continue to be a Catholic. Going back to Judaism was almost more complicated than becoming a Catholic, quite frankly, because she didn't know how to be a Jew. She really was so young when she was taken away. She didn't know what Judaism was. She had had an informal education, and she continued to be afraid to be Jewish even when she was with Auntie. That took a number of years before that subsided. My aunt told her, I'm going to turn you into a Jew. And the more she forced my mother to be Jewish, the more my mother ran away to church. And in fact, in 1979, I went to Paris with my mom, and she took me to the pew in the church where she used to run to. And her life was chaotic and had been chaotic for so many years. And I sat in this pew with her in this absolutely beautiful, quiet, calm church. And I really understood how it could have continued to bring her solace and a sense of something familiar. Very slowly, she learned that it was okay to be Jewish. There was a first cousin who had survived. He had the kindness and empathy and perhaps just simply the psychological capacity to help my mother understand that she did come from a Jewish family, that her parents were Jewish, and that her parents would have wanted her to remain Jewish. Auntie Sally was an amazing woman, but she was also struggling with her own losses of her children and her husband. I knew her for many, many years, and she just didn't have the bandwidth of psychological capacity to help my mom slowly, gently understand the need to come back to being Jewish. Mom said that being in Paris really helped because in Paris they lived in a survivor community, and there she really came to know the stories of the survivors. She came to learn about Judaism. Auntie introduced traditional Jewish values back into the home. And she became very proud of the history and the survival of the Jews, including herself. And she clearly remembers 1948 when the State of Israel was announced. She remembers the singing and the dancing in the streets. And she realized that had Israel existed, the Holocaust most likely would never have happened. And this really reaffirmed her pride in the Jew and in her lifelong love of Israel.
And I really feel that the presence of the church in her life really gave her that kind of psychological holding when she did not have her parents with her. And it's so moving that, you know, the only thing the Matusevich family actually asked from her was to have a mass said for Joseph Matusevich after his death, and what a sense of you know, what a sense of, would say, shlemut, of wholeness, of completion that gave your mother to arrange that for him in Toronto. So as we know, it became dangerous. Life with the Matusevich family became too dangerous because the Ukrainians raided the home, and she was then returned to your grandfather in the Hochtief slave labor camp. And you've described for us, you know, this time she spent there hiding while he was working all day. In this little piece of film now, we hear about her experiences during that time. And we're going now to our fifth film.
When I returned to my father, I was very happy to see him and be with him, although the conditions were not very good. He was in one room with two other men. I slept on a cot with him. And when he went to work in the morning and the other two went to work, there was a piece of furniture in the room, like a wardrobe. So he put me in there, and I stayed in there all day until he came back. And, you know, every footstep, every noise, I couldn't come out, so I was afraid. One day I did come out, and I went to the window, and another Jew saw me, thank God. And he told my father, so I never did that again. His sun was shining. I was 8 years old, and I'm stuck in this piece of furniture. But I was so afraid that I stayed. I stayed put. In the meantime, my father and this Joseph were working feverishly to try and get me out of there. Joseph had to figure out where he could take me because he didn't want to take me back to his home. He had a nephew who was a Catholic priest, very close to the Russian border. So one day I had to say goodbye to my father, and he explained to me again that I had to go. And they took me out again, and we went on the train. It was full of soldiers. I had a suit. He had my suitcase, so he put it on the floor, told me to lay on it and pretend I'm sleeping, so nobody would talk to me. And that's how we got there. I can't remember how long. I know it took a long time, quite a few hours. It was the last time I saw my father. I never saw him again. He took me to this parsonage, to this priest and his housekeeper, and he left me there. So it was a huge change again. I'm only 8 years old.
Father Michael hides your mother, as you said, for a year, in an incredibly anti-Semitic and hostile environment, particularly at risk from his own housekeeper, who we later find out after the war is imprisoned for crimes which aren't described, but which are some kind of terrible crime she's committed during the war. And rather extraordinarily, we do have a record of that time because he himself was a very keen amateur photographer. And we have some of those photographs here of your mother taken by Father Michael during this time. So if we can show you, we'd love to share a couple of photographs from this time that we have of her during this time with Father Michael. And her account, particularly in the book, she sounds so strong. But with these photos, we see what a small and vulnerable child she was. As I said before, they discovered after the war that Carola Pani, who we see, I think, in one of the photographs, perhaps we can see her next photo. Yeah, there she is on the left-hand side, was imprisoned. So their lives were very much in danger. Your mother and Father Michael's lives were in danger, and she has to disappear into this this environment to blend in. It's so important that he wanted to document life through photography, and she was able to receive these photographs after the war. What sort of a difference did having the photographs make for her, Ruthie?
You know, my mother doesn't have any concrete thing to remind her of her parents. Absolutely nothing. Everything was taken away. And when the parents were killed, there was nothing. At one point, Mr. Machchevich actually went back to the landlord to see if he could get some of the possessions. But this man who had saved them at one point had no interest in doing it a second time. So my mother has nothing. The only thing we have are a few photographs. For all of us, it is, as the rabbis just said, it's a real reminder of what a little vulnerable teen child she was, and yet how strong she had to be to manage through that time. For us, it's the only visual we have of what she looked like. It's the only visual to give us even the slightest idea of what her life looked like. So yes, these are very precious items for us. And, we're very grateful that Lucia thought to give them to my mother and that we have them with us today.
Well, she returns once again, as you said before, to the Matusevich family for her own safety, by which time she knows that her father has died. She only finds out how he was murdered after Joseph wrote to her in Canada in 1956, after she was married, and only after your mother had actually really begged him to share the details many, many times. And as you said before his death, your grandfather had written a letter to a cousin in the Congo, listing the names and addresses of every known member of the family, every living relative. And Joseph Matusevich, after the war, sends a postcard to every single person in the family, including your maternal great aunt Esther Begletter in Brooklyn, who immediately sends a telegram to her sister Sala Stern in Poland. And on the 1st of April 1946, your auntie Sala arrives by car to collect Anita from the Matusevich family. And as you said, your auntie Sarah herself had had devastating losses. And then they make their way to Paris. They journey to Paris, and there they are there till they're able to receive a visa for Canada. But lots happens in Paris, and I think there is a meeting with Schindler that would be really interesting for you to tell us about now.
So the meeting with Schindler was en route to Paris, so you're absolutely right about that. As I had said, my aunt was saved by Schindler, so if you know his story, she was from Krakow, and she had been sent to the ghetto in Krakow and then to the concentration camp of Plaszow, and from Plaszow, Schindler saved just over 1,000 Jews. Women inadvertently got sent to Auschwitz on the way to Brunlitz, which is the factory that he kept them safely at. Was in Czechoslovakia for the remainder of the war. My aunt was one of the ones who actually got sent into Auschwitz, and if you've seen the film, Schindler went to Auschwitz and made them give back his women. In Brunlitz, my aunt had worked in the kitchen for Schindler, and she became quite good friends with him. So when she found my mother and was determined to get out of Europe and hopefully get to New York, she had to attach a photograph of my mother to her dead daughter's passport to get her out. They went through Warsaw, which was completely demolished. There was only rubble. And then they ended up in Regensburg, Germany, which is where she was living. My aunt, as I had said, wasn't one for giving explanation or really helping a young child understand what, why, and where about the things that they were doing. So my mother just found herself being dragged through Germany and into a German's home. And she was extremely angry with my aunt. She couldn't understand, why was she with Germans? Why was she in this German's home? My aunt did not explain it, and that actually caused quite a rift between the two of them for a long time. I think it was much later that my mother came to understand who Schindler in fact was. And then they made their way to Paris. Paris was the beginning of things that were better. My mom went to school, and I think that's her single happiest memory. She finally was able to go to school. She was held back a few years because, of course, she had no foundational skills. She had not been to school yet. She didn't speak the language. But that was a really good and happy time for her. It's complicated for my aunt, however. My aunt met Uncle Jack in Paris, and these two damaged people who had no business getting married did marry each other. My Uncle Jack had a daughter. She was his sole survivor, and she'd been also saved by a Catholic family. And in Paris, they made this new, very damaged family that ultimately came to Canada in 1948-49. The good part of that story was that Terry, my mom's sister, with no blood connection at all, is very much my Auntie Terry, and very much a loved family member who continues to be a loved family member to this day. You go ahead.
I particularly think, actually, you know, the way your mother, I just feel, and I just want to say, I know you need to plug your book, because actually you can hardly buy it. There's hardly any more left in the UK. I think you have some in your basement. So I don't need to plug your book because it's too complicated. But I think she describes in a very honest way the kind of the family issues and how difficult it is to sort of reconstitute a family. And also how she met your wonderful late father, Frank, how they fell in love, the difficulties they had as a young couple of, you know, in those first few years of being accepted by his family, and then went on nevertheless to actually have an extremely happy marriage. And the wonderful story of her return to study, graduating the same year as your brother from university in the same year group, and how much joy that brought her. I'd love us to leave some time for questions and answers at the end, but I'd love you to just, if there's any other story you'd like to share from her life in Canada now, or anything else you'd like to share from the more recent, or perhaps you'd like to share with us the day you were able to you were in Jerusalem and you met a group, you visited the grave of Oskar Schindler, and what happened to you there.
Sure. For me, that's a beautiful story. It's a very emotional story. I had the opportunity to travel to Poland and Israel multiple times with my mother on an amazing program called the March of the Rebbe, which takes grade 11 students internationally, tens of thousands at a time on an annual basis, to Poland and into Israel. We bring educators from Israel who travel with us. one of these educators, his name is Michael, became very attached to my mother and her story, and we became friends. Fast forward a couple of years, and I found myself back in Israel, traveling to raise money for a group called One Family Fund, and they raised money for victims of terror attacks in Israel. And the tour guide for the day that we were spending in Jerusalem, by complete coincidence, happened to be Michael. And we spent the day touring all the sites that we were supposed to. And at the end of the day, he asked the group if they'd like to come for a little bit of an extra tour. He said he wanted to show me something. And I had no idea what we were doing or where we were going. And I found myself in a cemetery. And as we got closer to the destination that we were going to, Michael very briefly told the group that my mother, he traveled to Poland with her many times. He knew that she had had Oscar Schindler as part of her story. And the next thing I knew, we were standing next to Oscar Schindler's grave. And it was a very powerful moment for me. I told my mother's story at his request to the group as we were all standing there. And I remember clearly ending it by saying, you know, it's just extraordinary how one person and the actions of one person can make such a difference. If it hadn't been for Schindler, we wouldn't have Auntie. And if we didn't have Auntie, my mother would still be a Polish Catholic girl living in Kluczbork, Poland. But because we have my mother, I was there being able to tell my story to this wonderful group of people in Jerusalem. And in fact, I'm able to be here with you today to share my mother's story. So thank you for allowing me to tell that lovely story.
I think the impact of single individual acts just runs through your mother's life, and it's something that she talks about with such generosity and awe, and that is also so important in how we think about her history and the history of your family. I'd love us now to really have a little bit of time for any questions that people might like to ask. There's so much more that we could tell. We've actually only skimmed the surface. There's so much detail really that we could share. But let's see if we have any questions or comments or thoughts. What we'd like to invite you to do is to raise your hand if there's something you'd like to ask. You can do that physically in the old-fashioned way, like pick your hand up, or you can use the raise hand feature. If you turn your cameras on, everybody, it's nice, we can see you, see that you're here with us. So we invite you to do that now. And it's over to any questions or thoughts or comments that people would like to share.
We have two screens, so I'll have to look on both screens. If you do have a question, please either use the reaction button or raise your hand.
Oh, I see Andrea has put her hand up. Should we go over to you, Andrea? One of our co-chairs, Sha'arei Tzedek, co-chair of our community.
Hello, thank you. Ruthie, thank you so much. That was incredible. I was engrossed from beginning to end. It was a fantastic story of survival. My question to you, I was very lucky way back when I was 18. I went to Poland and Germany and Israel on a Holocaust seminar, and I got to go to the death camps, and I was with survivors, and I was also with quite a few second generation youngsters then. I'm just curious now where you see your journey going, because obviously it's been so much a part of your life for so long, and your mum is obviously not well enough to to carry on telling her story. I just wondered if you feel that you're obliged to carry on, if you want to carry on, just kind of where it leaves you now. If you want to share that with us.
That is such a good,
personal.
it's a very good question, and it's a very hard question. And there are some days where I think I really don't want to talk about this anymore because it's been front and center for such a great deal of my life. But I think the reality is I will likely be part of a second G group in Toronto that is, we're devoting our time and attention right now to try and figure out how exactly to carry on telling these stories, because we feel the importance of telling history, telling the truth. There is such an incredible amount of anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, racism that is emanating up again. And I do feel a tremendous obligation to continue in some capacity teaching. We're looking at different models of doing that, and I'll keep you posted. I'll be involved at some level. We're playing around with what that will look like now, and it could look like this a little bit. Telling my mom's story through documentary and conversation, and hoping that there's continued interest. Really, I thank all of you so very much for showing interest. It's not normal that it's a child of a survivor who speaks. So thank you for everybody who showed up and did show that interest. And I'm hoping that over the next generations, as we lose the last of our survivors, there will be interest for second generation and third generation to start to tell the stories and keep the truth alive.
Well, hopefully we'll have the recordings, because those recordings from your mum speaking are so powerful.
They make me cry every time.
Sorry, it gets you. I saw it must be so difficult. As much as it was difficult for your mum, you having to relive it each time, I could see how difficult that also is. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jeremy Silverstone, I see that you have a hand up. Would you like to come in now?
Thank you very much. And thank you, Ruthie, for telling your incredible story, your mum's incredible story. How does she feel now about those who were her enemies before?
Great question. I know that answer unequivocally because she has been saying it her entire life. Absolutely do not hate. Do not hate the Poles, because there were some really good ones who saved her life. And do not hate the Germans, because the Germans today were not even born during that time period. And even more so, hating only harms the person that's doing the hating. It doesn't have any impact on the people you're hating. So Mum would absolutely, unequivocally say, do not hate. In fact, she would say, speak out anytime against hatred, intolerance, racism, stand up to it, speak out about it. You know, the saying is that the Holocaust was started with words. So you must combat it right at the beginning with words, because quite frankly, by the time you get to concentration camps, it's a little bit too late. But do not hate ever anyone, period. Thank you for the question.
There's a wonderful piece of, there are very, very many films actually of your mother, as you know, and one of the most moving are the documents, the films of the granddaughter of the Matusevich family, speaking, receiving, I think receiving an award or something on behalf of the family. I can't quite remember. I think it's as part of March of the Living. Yes. And she calls your mother her grandmother, and they have their arms around each other, and you can see the sort of genuine depth and warmth of their relationship through the generations. It's absolutely so beautiful and inspiring, and for this young Polish woman to be such a beacon of hope for the future and such a clear voice because of the relationship of your families, just so powerful. I think I see Ros Levinson had a hand up. Yep. Over to you.
Hi, Ruthie. Thank you so much. I echo what everybody else has been saying. because of your mother's experiences, once she married and you and your brother came along, was she particularly overprotective? Was she always sort of worried that this would happen again and you would now be in her shoes?
Yes. Very simple answer. My mom, the brunt of that, quite honestly, was on me. I had an older brother. I have an older brother and a younger brother. My mom was petrified to have me out of her sight. So my entire growing up years, if I left the room, she would yell, "Ruthie, where are you?" I wasn't allowed to go out at night. If I didn't go out with my older brother as a teenager, I wasn't actually allowed to leave the house. She was just petrified that she was going to lose her family again. And I'm named for her mother. And I think she often saw me as her mother, and she was petrified of losing me. So yes, it was constant.
So as you say, your life has been really overshadowed by this whole thing. You're walking in her footsteps all the time.
We have been, yes.
Yeah.
She's got some pretty big shoes to fill.
I know, you're doing a good job. Thank you.
So one of the things, when we began to think about this evening, Ruthie and Lorraine, I guess, the thing that came across so profoundly was also very much the feeling that I've learned from my colleague, Rabbi Barden, is that this is very much about making space and listening to the stories that survivors have to tell themselves, and that we were really conscious of doing that. And you said, of course, in that first conversation, you said, well, of course, I'm really here to tell my mother's story. That's what's really important to me. And we have we've really consciously thought about how to do that, and that we've thought that perhaps, with the awful kind of issue of facing COVID, that has presented this weird opportunity to have a conversation across an enormous distance, both geographical, but also to be able to have a conversation with your mother's testimony as well. And that is a remarkable thing. I think you've also mentioned there were holograms at the Holocaust Education Centre, which I think takes us in another imaginative journey. And we are very much here about telling that story, and with us in a closer way as we possibly can. And I suppose what we're doing is we're discovering how to do that, and that the situation we're in now has kind of enforced on us an urgency to find a way to do that, one that was already there, but now a new and indeed a new opportunity. We have this wonderful opportunity to have a conversation we would have never ever have imagined before. I think it would have been a private conversation between yourself and Lorraine perhaps over time, but that has been very generously opened out to include us all in, and we are so incredibly grateful for that. And I think we're also in awe of your willingness to come and to be here, because your mother says it takes it out of me every time, and I can only imagine that must also be the same for you to some extent. Shall we just have an opportunity for any last comments, thoughts, questions? Okay, so we are going to end with moving as a community to Kaddish. We're going to come together as one group of people. I'm going to invite us in a moment to stand. There are so many names. There are so many that we are unable to name, but we are going to say Kaddish together. And then after Kaddish, we will have an opportunity to see some wonderful images from your mother's life, from your family life. It will take us all the way through, so that we also see some extremely happy moments, such as their wedding and some of the wonderful events that you've celebrated together as a family in the last few years. So once again, before we move to Kaddish and our final images, I just really love to thank you so very much. And I would also, before we do that, like to go over to Lorraine Feldman, who is going to ask you a couple of, or she's going to say some closing words and ask you one final question.
Thank you, Shulamit. Before Rabbi Shulamit leads us in Kaddish, I would like to just say a big personal thank you to Ruthie once again for joining us this afternoon and sharing her mum's incredible story. Every time I hear it, I'm moved even more. You mentioned, though, when we spoke earlier, before we started the event, that your mum would always end her Holocaust education talks with a final thought. Would you like to share one of these with us tonight?
There would be just a few things she'd say at the end of every speech, and in no particular order. Kiss your parents and tell them you love them. That was one. Don't hate. That was two. Be appreciative of living in a democratic country and do not take it for granted. That was three. Be proud to be Jewish. Be proud to love Israel. And lastly, how one person can make such an enormous difference and can save a world. Mr. Matuszewicz was that person in our life. He saved our world, and we will always be grateful to that incredible man who saved one little Polish child. So now there are children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and one great-grandchild in a tummy waiting to be born, all because of this church. So thank you for letting me have that final say, because I know that's what Mom would tell you if she was here today.
Thank you. And her really brilliant character comes through so much in those words. Thank you so very much. Let's stand now and we will see, I believe, the words of Kaddish before us on the screen. No, we won't. Okay. Take a moment to think of all of those whose lives were lost. Yitgadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah, v'amar divrach chirutei, v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayachon u'v'yom echol u'v'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael, v'agalah v'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei Shemei Rabbah mavarach le'olam olam me'amaya, yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ah v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yithada v'yitale v'yithalal Shemei dekudisha b'richu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbachata v'nechemata de amiram be'amar, ve'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shamaya, v'chayim aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael, ve'imru amen. Osei shalom b'mromav, hu ya'asei shalom, aleinu v'yal kol Yisrael, v'yal kol ha'olam, ve'imru amen. We're now going to end with some images of your mother's life.
That was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's only midday in Canada, so we wish you a really lovely rest of the day, and we wish everyone else here really, really good evening, and thank you so much for being with us.
One last time for having me. It was really an honor.
Thank you.
Bye from Canada, everyone.
Thank you everybody for attending this evening, and have a good evening. Good night.
Good night.